I realized it wasn't just coincidence the third time Zachary showed up at my apartment after midnight. The first time, it had almost been funny. He texted me around 12:30 a.m. "You awake?" I was halfway through a terrible action movie and eating cereal straight from the box, so I answered immediately. "Yeah." "Why?" 10 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Zachary stood there in a dark hoodie with his hands shoved into the pockets like he suddenly wasn't sure why he'd come. "I was driving around," he said casually. "Thought maybe you'd still be up." I laughed and stepped aside. "You drove 20 minutes at midnight because you thought I might be bored?" He grinned. "You make it sound weird when you say it like that." At the time, I didn't think much about it. Zachary had always been like that with me. Random. Impulsive. Showing up out of nowhere with coffee or asking if I wanted to go on late-night walks because he couldn't sit still. We'd known each other for almost a year by then, after meeting through mutual friends, and somewhere along the way he'd quietly become the person I talked to more than anyone else. Still, I told myself that was just who he was. Friendly. Restless. A little too charming without realizing it. The second time happened 2 weeks later. I'd had a horrible day at work. My manager dumped extra projects on me, my car battery died in the rain, and by the time I got home I was exhausted enough to ignore every text on my phone. Around 11 p.m., someone knocked. I opened the door already annoyed, expecting delivery or a neighbor. It was Zachary. Holding takeout. "You disappeared all day," he said immediately. "I figured you either got kidnapped or were having a breakdown." I stared at him. "So your solution was showing up here?" "Well," he replied, lifting the bag, "I also brought dumplings." That night felt different somehow. We sat on my couch eating takeout while some random playlist hummed quietly in the background. Zachary kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, like he was checking whether I'd finally relaxed. At one point I caught him doing it. "What?" I asked. "Nothing. You're staring." "I'm observing." I rolled my eyes. "That sounds creepier somehow." He laughed, leaning his head back against the couch. "You looked sad earlier." The softness in his voice caught me off guard. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Yeah," he murmured. "You always say that." Neither of us spoke for a few seconds after that. The room suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. Then Zachary smiled again, lighter this time, like he'd realized he'd let the moment get too real. "Anyway," he said, nudging my leg with his knee, "your taste in movies is awful." I laughed, and the tension dissolved. But later that night, after he left, I kept thinking about the way he looked at me. Like my bad mood had genuinely bothered him. Like he'd come over because he couldn't stand the idea of me sitting alone with it. The third time was when I finally understood this wasn't random anymore. It was raining hard enough to shake the windows. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with my laptop still open when pounding on my apartment door dragged me awake around 1 in the morning. Half asleep, I stumbled over and opened it. Zachary stood there drenched. His hair was soaked, hoodie clinging to his shoulders, chest rising fast like he'd run upstairs instead of taking the elevator. "Jesus Christ," I said. "What happened to you?" He blinked at me for a second before answering. "I was nearby." "At 1 in the morning? During a storm?" Another pause. Then he looked past me into my apartment and said quietly, "Can I come in?" Something in his expression made me step aside immediately. He walked in slowly while I grabbed a towel from the bathroom. When I handed it to him, our fingers brushed briefly. Neither of us pulled away right away. That was new. "You want to explain why you look like the main character in a breakup scene?" I asked carefully. He laughed under his breath, but it sounded tired. "My friends dragged me out," he said. "I left early." "Okay. And I ended up here." The way he said it made my stomach tighten slightly. Not because it sounded casual. Because it didn't. He dried his hair roughly with the towel while I watched him from across the kitchen counter. There was something nervous about him tonight. restless energy underneath all the usual confidence. You could have texted first, I said. Yeah. But you didn't. Nope. Rain hammered against the windows. Zachary looked at me for a long second before speaking again. You ever realize something about yourself all at once? He asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. What kind of something? He shrugged, but his jaw tightened. The kind you can unknow after. I felt my heartbeat slow and heavy in my chest. Neither of us moved. Then he smiled suddenly, like he was trying to save both of us from whatever this conversation was becoming. Forget it, he muttered. I'm exhausted. But I didn't forget it. Because for the first time since meeting Zachary, I realized something that suddenly felt painfully obvious. People don't keep finding excuses to show up at the same person's door after midnight by accident. And I had a feeling he was starting to realize it too. I tried to act normal after that night. That was the problem. Once you notice something shifting between you and another person, normal becomes impossible. Every conversation starts sounding layered. Every glance feels longer than it used to. Even silence changes shape. And Zachary suddenly seemed to be everywhere. Good morning texts. Random memes during work hours. Calls that started with, quick question, and somehow turned into 2-hour conversations about absolutely nothing. Before, I'd accepted all of it without thinking. Now I kept catching myself wondering why. 3 days after the storm, he showed up at my office building during lunch. Not inside. Outside. Leaning against his car with sunglasses on like he was filming a music video nobody asked for. I stopped dead on the sidewalk. What are you doing here? He grinned immediately. You sounded stressed this morning. So you came to my job? I brought food, he corrected. That's not a correction. He held up a paper bag. Burger bribery usually works on you. I should have told him he was insane. Instead, I laughed and got into the car. That was always the problem with Zachary. He made ridiculous behavior feel weirdly natural. We parked near the river and ate in the front seats with the windows cracked open. Sunlight reflected off the water outside while music played quietly from his speakers. You know, I said eventually, most people just send supportive texts. Most people are lazy. I snorted. Then I caught him looking at me again. That same look from my apartment. Focused. Quiet. Too soft. What? I asked. He looked away immediately. Nothing. You keep doing that. Doing what? Looking at me like you're trying to solve a problem. That made him laugh under his breath, but there was tension underneath it. Maybe I am. Something tightened low in my stomach. Before I could answer, his phone buzzed loudly through the speakers. The screen lit up on the dashboard. Jenna calling. Zachary sighed instantly. You gonna answer? I asked. Not really. But the phone kept vibrating. Finally, he grabbed it and answered on speaker for exactly 5 seconds. Hey. Zachary, where are you? Everyone's asking. I'm busy. With Erin again? The words hit me strangely. Not because she sounded jealous. Because she sounded annoyed. Like this was a pattern. Zachary glanced at me before responding. Yeah. I'll call you later. He hung up immediately. The silence afterward felt different. What was that? I asked lightly. He shrugged. My friends think I spend too much time with you. And do you? His eyes flicked toward me again. No, he said quietly. I don't think I spend enough. My chest went completely tight. The thing about Zachary was that he rarely sounded serious. Even emotional conversations usually came wrapped in jokes or sarcasm. But not this time. This time he looked nervous after saying it. Like the words had slipped out before he could stop them. I looked down at the fries in my lap mostly because suddenly looking directly at him felt dangerous. You know, I said carefully, people are eventually gonna start getting ideas. He leaned back in his seat slowly. Maybe they already have. The air inside the car suddenly felt too warm. I laughed softly to break the tension. You're being weird lately. Lately? More than usual. He smiled faintly at that, but it faded fast. Then he asked very quietly, Does it bother you? I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the nervousness hiding underneath his calm expression. At the way his fingers tapped once against the steering wheel before going still again. And suddenly I understood something else too. Zachary wasn't testing me accidentally. He was waiting. Waiting to see if I'd pull away. Waiting to see if I'd make him stop. Waiting to see whether this thing between us only existed in his head. The realization hit hard enough that I forgot to answer for a second. Aaron? He asked softly. No, I said finally. His expression shifted slightly. No what? It doesn't bother me. Neither of us moved after that. Outside, people walked past the car without noticing anything strange. Inside, it felt like the entire atmosphere had tilted sideways. Zachary stared at me for a long moment before exhaling quietly through his nose. Okay, he murmured. Just okay. But somehow it sounded relieved. That should have been the moment one of us said something honest. Instead, we both got scared of how real the conversation had suddenly become. So Zachary started joking again. I pretended my heart wasn't racing. And we drove back to my office talking about stupid things like nothing had changed. But everything had. Because for the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't stop replaying one specific thing in my head. Not the way he looked at me. Not the comment from his friend. The question. Does it bother you? People don't ask that unless they already know exactly what they're doing. After that lunch, Zachary stopped pretending. Not openly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But with me? Everything became intentional. He started touching me constantly in small ways that could still be explained away. A hand on my shoulder when he walked past. His knee pressed against mine whenever we sat together. Fingers brushing my wrist during conversations like he wanted to see if I'd react. And the worst part was that I did react. Every time. A week later, a bunch of us went to a rooftop bar downtown for one of our friends' birthdays. Loud music. String lights overhead. Too many people packed too close together. Normally Zachary loved places like that. He was social in an effortless way that made strangers immediately gravitate toward him. But that night, he barely left my side. At first I tried not to think about it. Then Jenna cornered me near the drinks table. You know he's obsessed with you, right? She said casually. I nearly choked on my drink. What? She laughed at my expression. Oh my God! You seriously don't see it? I think you're drunk. I think Zachary has spent 6 straight months inventing reasons to be around you. I opened my mouth to deny it automatically. Then stopped. Because suddenly every late-night visit, every random appearance, every unnecessary text replayed in my head all at once. Jenna noticed my silence immediately. Oh, she said slowly. Wait. You do see it. Before I could answer, Zachary appeared beside us out of nowhere. What are we talking about? He asked. Nothing, I said way too quickly. Jenna looked between us with the expression of someone watching a movie where the characters were painfully behind the plot. She replied. I'm gonna go before this gets embarrassing. She walked away smiling to herself. I avoided looking at Zachary. That seemed ominous, he said lightly. Jenna likes creating drama. True. But I could feel him studying me now. You okay? He asked quietly. Yeah. You're lying. The way he said it sent heat straight into my chest. I looked over finally. Big mistake. The rooftop lights reflected softly in his eyes, and for a second the noise around us disappeared completely. He was standing too close again. Close enough that I could smell his cologne underneath the cold night air. You've been acting strange since lunch, I admitted before I could stop myself. His expression didn't change. But his voice got quieter. Strange how? You know how. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then, somehow, he smiled slightly. Maybe I wanted you to notice. That hit hard enough that I forgot how to breathe correctly for a second. Zachary. Aaron, he interrupted softly. I need you to tell me if I'm imagining this. The nervousness in his voice shocked me more than the words themselves. Because Zachary was never nervous. Not around people. Not socially. Not ever. But right now, he looked genuinely terrified of my answer. You're not imagining it, I admitted quietly. The second the words left my mouth, his entire expression changed. Not dramatic. Not shocked. Just relief. Pure relief. Like he'd been carrying tension in his chest for months and finally got permission to let himself breathe. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then someone shouted Zachary's name from across the rooftop. We both looked away immediately. The moment cracked apart just enough for reality to rush back in. Our friends. The party. People everywhere. Zachary rubbed the back of his neck once before looking at me again. Walk with me, he asked quietly. I nodded before thinking too hard about it. We left the rooftop and headed down the stairwell into the quieter lower levels of the building. The city noise faded behind us until it was just our footsteps echoing softly off concrete walls. Halfway down the stairs, Zachary stopped walking. I nearly ran into him. He turned toward me slowly, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, again the same nervous habit from the night he showed up at my apartment in the rain. I've been trying really hard not to do this badly, he admitted. I leaned lightly against the railing, heart pounding. Do what badly? This. His eyes stayed locked on mine. I kept telling myself it was just a phase or a crush or whatever, he continued quietly. But then I started realizing every good part of my day somehow involved you. My chest tightened painfully. Aaron, I look for you everywhere now. The honesty in his voice completely wrecked me. You make me feel insane, he added with a soft laugh. I'd drive to your apartment at 1 a.m. because something good happens and you're the first person I want to tell. Something bad happens and you're still the first person I want. I swallowed hard. He stepped one stair closer. And I realized recently. His voice lowered slightly. This isn't coincidence anymore. There it was. The thing we'd both been circling around for weeks. Maybe months. I should have said something immediately. Instead, I just stared at him because my brain suddenly felt useless. Zachary watched my face carefully the entire time. If you don't feel the same way, he said quietly, I'll stop. Seriously. I don't want to ruin this. That almost made me laugh because by then it already felt ruined in the best possible way. There was no going back to normal after this. Not when my heart reacted to him like this. Not when I'd started waiting for his texts before even realizing I was doing it. Not when seeing his name on my phone had become the best part of my day too. You didn't ruin anything, I said softly. His eyes searched mine carefully. No? I shook my head once. Then, before I could overthink it, I stepped closer too. The breath he let out sounded shaky. For a second neither of us moved. Then Zachary smiled very slightly and whispered, Okay. Good. And somehow those two words felt more intimate than anything else he could have said. The elevator ride back up felt unbearable. Not because anything bad had happened. Because everything had. Zachary stood beside me with his hands in his pockets again, staring straight ahead while the numbers above the door slowly changed floors. Neither of us spoke. But the silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was awareness. Heavy. Electric. Impossible to ignore. Every few seconds, I caught him glancing at me from the corner of his eye before immediately looking away again like he couldn't help himself. You're smiling, I said finally. He blinked. I am not. You literally are. Okay, he admitted quietly, and the smile only got worse. Maybe a little. I laughed under my breath. The sound seemed to relax him instantly. That's what kept happening between us now, tiny moments where one of us remembered the other person felt the same way, and suddenly the tension turned softer instead of terrifying. When the elevator doors opened back onto the rooftop, the noise hit us immediately again. Music. Conversations. Glasses clinking. Reality. Zachary hesitated before stepping out. Then his fingers brushed mine. Quick. Testing. I looked at him immediately. He looked nervous again. Which honestly would have been adorable if my own heart wasn't trying to kill me. So before I could lose my courage, I turned my hand slightly and loosely intertwined my fingers with his. The reaction was instant. His entire body stilled for half a second. Then he looked down at our hands like he couldn't quite believe I'd done that. Neither could I, honestly. Aaron, he murmured softly. What? That's really unfair. I tried to sound calm. What is? You can't do stuff like that without warning. Despite the complaint, he tightened his hand around mine slightly. We walked back toward our friends like that, subtle enough that nobody immediately noticed, but obvious enough that it definitely meant something. Jenna noticed in approximately 3 seconds. Her eyes widened dramatically before she covered her mouth with both hands like she was witnessing history. Oh my God! She whispered loudly. Relax, Zachary muttered. I knew it. Several people looked over at her, yelling. I immediately tried to let go of Zachary's hand out of reflex, but he stopped me. That surprised me enough that I looked at him again. He didn't let go. Not this time. And suddenly I remembered the conversation in his car. My friends think I spend too much time with you. Maybe they already have ideas. He wasn't scared anymore. Or maybe he was, but he'd decided I mattered more than the fear. The realization hit me so hard I almost missed half the conversation happening around us afterward. At some point everyone migrated toward the rooftop edge to take pictures with the skyline behind them. Zachary stayed beside me the entire time, shoulder pressed lightly against mine. You're quiet, he said softly. I'm thinking. Dangerous. I smiled faintly before glancing at him again. You really don't do anything halfway, huh? He looked genuinely confused. What do you mean? Last month you were pretending this was all accidental. And now? I looked down briefly at where our hands still occasionally brushed when we walked. Now Jenna's probably planning our wedding. That made him laugh loudly enough that a couple people turned toward us. Then his expression softened again almost immediately. I spent months trying not to want this, he admitted quietly. The honesty in his voice wrecked me every single time. Why? I asked softly. He looked out over the city lights before answering. Because once I realized it was real, he exhaled slowly. You became the one thing I could actually lose. That landed directly in my chest. Before I could respond, one of our friends shouted for us to join a group photo. Zachary groaned dramatically. If I blink in another one of these, I'm deleting myself from the friend group. You're very photogenic. You'll survive. That sounded flirty. It wasn't. It definitely was. By the time the party finally started winding down, it was almost 2 in the morning. A few people ordered rideshares. Others stumbled toward nearby apartments downtown. Eventually it was just me and Zachary standing near the parking garage entrance while cold wind moved through the empty streets around us. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. So, he said carefully, what happens now? The question felt bigger than he probably intended. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets mostly to keep myself grounded. I don't know, I admitted honestly. Helpful answer. You asked a complicated question. He smiled slightly. Fair. For a second we just stood there looking at each other. Then Zachary stepped closer. Not dramatically. Not rushed. Just enough that the space between us disappeared again. I meant what I said downstairs, he said quietly. About not wanting to ruin this. You didn't. His eyes searched mine carefully. You sure? Instead of answering immediately, I looked at him properly. At the nervousness he kept trying to hide. At the way he kept glancing at my mouth before catching himself. At how strangely careful someone like Zachary suddenly became when he genuinely cared about something. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for days. When did you know? He smiled instantly soft and almost embarrassed. That's the annoying part, he admitted. I think everyone else figured it out before I did. I laughed quietly. That bad? Aaron, I once drove across town at midnight because you said over text that you might be getting sick. I stared at him. Oh my God! Yeah. And you still thought this was platonic? In my defense, I'm very stupid. I laughed hard enough that he smiled too, relief flashing briefly across his face again like he still couldn't fully believe this was real. Then the laughter faded. The silence returned. Warmer this time. Zachary looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. I really want to kiss you right now, he admitted softly. Every thought in my brain immediately disappeared. The city noise felt distant suddenly. Muted. You say things very casually for someone dropping emotional bombs every 10 minutes. I managed weakly. He grinned slightly. Sorry. Should I make a presentation first? I shook my head, smiling despite myself. Then quieter, before fear could interrupt me. No presentation necessary. His expression changed instantly. Something vulnerable flickered across his face so quickly it almost hurt to look at. You sure? He asked softly. I nodded once. That was all it took. He moved slowly, giving me every possible chance to stop this, and rested one hand lightly against my jaw before kissing me. It wasn't dramatic. Wasn't rushed. Just warm and careful and very, very real. And the strangest part was that nothing about it felt surprising. It felt inevitable. Like both of us had been heading toward this moment long before either one of us found the courage to say it out loud. Kissing Zachary changed everything immediately. And somehow, almost nothing at all. That was the strange part. The city still buzzed around us. Cars still moved through wet streets. Cold winds still cut between buildings downtown. But suddenly I was standing in the middle of it looking at him differently. No, not differently. Honestly. Because once he kissed me, I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just emotional confusion or blurred friendship lines. The feeling sitting in my chest finally had a name now. And judging by the way Zachary was looking at me afterward, he felt it too. Neither of us spoke for a second after we pulled apart. Then he let out a soft laugh against my forehead. Okay, he murmured. That was probably overdue. I laughed quietly too, mostly because if I didn't, I thought my heart might actually explode. You think? A little. He still hadn't moved away completely. One of his hands rested lightly against my jacket sleeve like he needed physical proof I was still there. The expression on his face completely ruined me. Not smug. Not casual. Relieved. Like this had mattered to him much more than he'd let himself admit. You're smiling again. I pointed out softly. You kissed me back, he replied immediately. I think I earned it. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't stop smiling either. Eventually we made ourselves separate enough to function like normal people again, though the atmosphere between us had changed so completely that even standing beside him felt different now. More aware. More dangerous. When we finally got into his car, either of us started the engine right away. Zachary leaned back in his seat and looked over at me quietly. So, he said after a minute, we should probably talk about this. That sounds responsible. Terrifying. But responsible. I turned slightly toward him. Okay. Talk. He exhaled slowly through his nose before answering. I don't want to do this halfway. The seriousness in his voice made my chest tighten immediately. You mean? I mean you matter too much to me already. His eyes stayed locked on mine. And if we're doing this, I don't want it to become some weird almost relationship where we pretend nothing changed. Something about hearing him say it out loud made everything suddenly feel very real. Not hypothetical anymore. Not tension. Not possibility. Real. You know what's funny? I admitted quietly. What? I think part of me knew this was happening before you did. He stared at me for a second before laughing softly. Honestly? That tracks. You were not subtle. Says the guy who looked at me like I personally invented happiness every time I entered a room. I immediately looked away. Okay, We're moving on. Nope. He grinned. Actually, I want to discuss that in detail. You're unbearable. And you like me anyway. The confidence in his voice should have annoyed me. Instead, it sent warmth straight into my chest because for the first time tonight he sounded genuinely relaxed again. Like admitting everything out loud had finally stopped whatever internal war he'd been fighting for months. Eventually, he drove me home. The ride was quieter than usual, but not uncomfortable. Every so often I'd catch him glancing toward me at red lights with this slightly disbelieving expression that made me want to laugh. What? I asked finally. I'm just adjusting. To what? To the fact that I can actually do this now. I blinked. Do what? He reached over casually and intertwined his fingers with mine across the center console. My entire brain immediately short-circuited. Oh, I said intelligently. Yeah, he murmured, smiling slightly. The terrifying thing was how natural it felt. Like we'd skipped past awkwardness somehow and landed directly in something familiar. When we pulled up outside my apartment building, either of us moved to get out. Zachary drummed his fingers lightly against the steering wheel once before looking over at me again. I should probably warn you, he said. That sounds ominous. I get attached fast? I stared at him. Then laughed softly under my breath. Zachary, you were already attached before we even kissed. Fair. The honesty between us now felt almost overwhelming sometimes. Like once the door opened, either of us knew how to go back to pretending. He looked at me quietly for another second. Then his expression softened in that dangerous way I was starting to realize only happened around me. I really like you, Aaron. The words hit harder than the kiss had. Because kisses could still be explained away emotionally. Impulsively. Momentarily. But this was deliberate. And suddenly I realized something terrifying too. I was already gone. Completely. I really like you too, I admitted softly. The look on his face afterward made my chest ache in the best possible way. Then he smiled slowly and leaned back in his seat again. Okay, he said quietly. Good. I was hoping that wasn't one-sided. I laughed softly. You're unbelievably needy for someone who acts confident all the time. You have no idea. The scary part? I wanted to know everything. Every complicated thought. Every nervous habit. Every part of him he usually hid underneath charm and sarcasm. And judging by the way Zachary kept looking at me like I was suddenly the center of his universe, I had a feeling he wanted the same thing. The next 2 weeks felt unreal. Not dramatic. Not chaotic. Just bright. That was the only way I could describe it. Every part of my life suddenly had Zachary in it somehow. Morning texts turned into morning calls. Late-night conversations became expected instead of accidental. He started showing up at my apartment with coffee so often that my neighbors began greeting him like he already lived there. And honestly, he practically did. One Friday night, I came home exhausted after work and found him sitting outside my apartment door with a paper bag of takeout balanced on his knee. You know normal people wait inside buildings, I said. He looked up immediately and smiled in that soft way that still completely destroyed me. You took too long, he replied simply. Something warm spread through my chest so fast it almost hurt. I unlocked the door, while he followed me inside talking about some argument he'd had with his coworkers earlier. Halfway through the story, he stopped suddenly. What? I asked. He was staring at me again. That happened constantly now. What? I repeated, laughing slightly. You smiled when you opened the door. Okay? No, like immediately. He looked weirdly pleased about it. You saw me and smiled before even saying anything. I rolled my eyes to hide how hard my heart reacted to that observation. You're very intense for someone who used to pretend this was all accidental. I was going through something. You were emotionally stalking me. That sounds criminal when you say it like that. I laughed hard enough that he grinned too, clearly satisfied with himself. That was becoming my favorite thing about Zachary, how obvious his feelings were now that he'd stopped hiding them. He looked for me constantly. Touched me absent-mindedly whenever we sat close together. Remembered tiny details I didn't even realize I'd mentioned. It should have scared me how fast this was becoming serious. Instead, it felt like relief. Like both of us had spent months holding our breath without realizing it. Later that night, we ended up lying on opposite ends of my couch while music played quietly through the apartment. Zachary was scrolling on his phone when he suddenly said, "My mom asked about you today." I looked over immediately. "What?" "She thinks we're dating." My stomach flipped. And I said yes. The room went completely quiet. Not tense. Just still. "You said it like that?" I asked softly. He shrugged slightly, though I noticed the nervousness underneath it immediately. "She asked if there was finally a reason I couldn't stop talking about one specific person." He glanced toward me carefully. "So I told her the truth." Something about that completely unraveled me. Because Zachary wasn't casual about family, or feelings, or anything real. And yet somehow he kept choosing honesty anyway. "What did she say?" I asked quietly. A smile spread slowly across his face. "She said she was wondering how long it would take me to figure myself out." I laughed softly in disbelief. "That's it. She also called me an idiot for waiting this long." "Smart woman. She's obsessed with you already, by the way." "That seems premature." "She saw one picture and said you looked trustworthy." I snorted. "What does that even mean?" "No idea. But congratulations." The conversation should have felt overwhelming. Instead, sitting there with him in the dim apartment light, it just felt right. Natural. Like this thing between us had stopped being fragile the second we both admitted how much we cared. Zachary looked at me quietly for another second before setting his phone down completely. Then, softer. "You know what scares me?" The sudden seriousness in his voice made me sit up slightly. "What?" "You make me want permanence." My heart stumbled hard against my ribs. He leaned back against the couch cushion, eyes fixed somewhere near the ceiling now. "I've never been good at staying still," he admitted quietly. "I get restless. I leave things before they can matter too much." I stayed quiet. Because this felt important. "But with you," he laughed softly under his breath. "Aaron, I catch myself planning months ahead automatically now." The honesty in his voice completely wrecked me. "I think about trips we should take." His eyes flicked toward mine again. "I think about introducing you to people before I even realize I'm doing it." The air felt heavier suddenly. "Not bad. Just real." "You make me feel settled," he admitted quietly. "And that's never happened to me before." I didn't know what to say to that. So instead I moved closer until our shoulders touched lightly against the couch. Zachary immediately relaxed into it like instinct. "You know," I said softly, "for someone who acts confident all the time, you get really nervous when you're being honest." He laughed quietly. "Because this matters." Then after a small pause, "You matter." That one almost took me out completely. I looked at him carefully. At the softness he only showed me. At the way his entire personality seemed calmer lately, like he'd finally stopped fighting himself. At how openly he cared now that he wasn't afraid anymore. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. This wasn't becoming love. It already was. I realized I was in love with Zachary on a Tuesday. Not during some huge romantic moment. Not after a kiss. Not during one of our late-night conversations where he accidentally said things that stayed in my chest for days afterward. It happened because he remembered I had a dentist appointment. That's it. I mentioned it once, casually, almost a week earlier while we were making dinner at my apartment. I barely remembered saying it myself. But at exactly 2:14 that afternoon, my phone buzzed. "Zachary. Did they judge your flossing habits or did you survive?" I stared at the message for a ridiculous amount of time. Then another text came immediately after. "Also, if they hurt you, I'm willing to fight a medical professional." I laughed out loud alone in my car. And suddenly it hit me all at once. The consistency. The care. The way he paid attention to tiny details because everything about me mattered to him automatically now. I sat there with my phone in my hand, realizing I was completely, hopelessly in love with him. The terrifying part? I didn't even want to run from it. By the time I got back to my apartment that evening, Zachary was already there. Again. At this point, he had his own hoodie draped over my couch, spare toiletries in my bathroom, and a habit of reorganizing my kitchen cabinets more efficiently, which I pretended to hate. He looked up from the couch immediately when I walked in. How traumatic was the dentist experience? I dropped my keys onto the counter slowly, still staring at him. What? He asked. You remembered. He blinked. Obviously? Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Something in my chest tightened painfully. Zachary noticed immediately. You okay? I laughed softly under my breath because somehow this beautiful idiot still didn't understand the effect he had on me. Yeah, I said quietly. I'm just realizing things. His expression shifted, instantly curious now, slightly cautious. That sounds dangerous. Probably. I walked over toward the couch slowly while he watched me the entire time. The apartment was quiet except for music humming softly through the speakers near the kitchen. Rain tapped lightly against the windows again, and the whole room felt warm in that intimate way it only did when it was just us. Zachary leaned back slightly against the couch cushions. You're staring at me weird, he informed me. I'm having a moment. Should I be scared? Maybe emotionally. That made him laugh softly. Then I sat beside him, close enough that our knees touched immediately. His smile faded slightly as he looked at me more carefully now. What's going on in your head? He asked quietly. There were probably safer ways to say this. Smarter ways. Less terrifying ways. Instead, I heard myself ask, do you ever feel like this happened really fast? Zachary stared at me for a second before answering. No. The certainty in his voice caught me off guard. No? He shook his head slowly. Aaron, I think part of me started falling for you the second you made fun of my music taste last winter. I laughed softly. Your music taste is genuinely terrible. See? Exactly that. His fingers brushed lightly against mine on the couch. I think we just spent a long time pretending this was less obvious than it actually was. That was probably true. Because looking back now, the signs were everywhere. The way he always looked for me first in crowded rooms. How he somehow memorized my routines without trying. The fact that every important conversation in his life eventually circled back to me somehow. Even our friends had known before we did. You know Jenna threatened me yesterday? Zachary said suddenly. I blinked. What? She said if I ever hurt your feelings, she'd ruin my life publicly. That seems fair. I agreed with her immediately, which honestly worried her more. I laughed hard enough that he smiled too, but it softened quickly afterward. Then he looked down briefly at our hands resting near each other before speaking again. You know what's weird? He murmured. What? I'm happier lately. The quiet honesty in his voice made my chest ache. I didn't realize how restless I felt all the time before you, he admitted. Everything used to feel temporary. His eyes lifted back toward mine slowly. But now I keep catching myself thinking about future stuff automatically. A faint smile appeared again. Like you're already included. There it was again. That terrifying sincerity he only showed me. And suddenly I couldn't hold the words back anymore. I love you. The second I said it, the room went completely still. Zachary froze. Not badly. Not awkwardly. Just stunned. Like the words had hit him harder than expected. For one horrible second I wondered if I'd moved too fast. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. And I swear I'd never seen anyone's expression turn that soft before in my entire life. Aaron, he said quietly, almost disbelieving. I suddenly felt nervous. You don't have to say it back right now, I just... He interrupted me by pulling me into a hug so quickly I nearly lost my balance. You absolute idiot, he murmured against my shoulder, laughing softly at the same time. Of course I love you too. My entire chest tightened painfully. He pulled back just enough to look at me again, one hand still resting against my arm like he physically needed contact now. I've been in love with you for months, he admitted quietly. I just didn't know how to survive saying it out loud. Something about that sentence completely shattered me in the best way. Because suddenly every late-night visit made sense. Every nervous glance. Every excuse to be near me. This had never been accidental. Not for either of us. For a while after that, everything felt almost unreal to me. Not because things changed dramatically. Because they didn't. Zachary still showed up at my apartment constantly. Still stole my hoodies. Still complained about my coffee being too depressing. Still looked for me first every time we entered a room together. The difference was that now either of us hid what it meant. 1 month later, we went to a friend's engagement party outside the city. It was held at this huge house near a lake, all warm lights and loud music and people dancing badly in somebody's backyard. The weather had finally started cooling down, so everyone kept drifting between the fire pit outside and the crowded kitchen inside. Normally social events exhausted me after a few hours. But that night, I couldn't stop smiling. Mostly because Zachary kept unconsciously gravitating toward me no matter where we were. Talking to friends? His hand rested lightly against my back. Across the yard? His eyes searched for me automatically. Someone made a joke? He looked at me first to see if I was laughing too. It had become instinct for both of us by then. At one point Jenna cornered me near the drinks table again. You look disgusting, she informed me. I blinked. Excuse me? You're doing that happy face constantly now. That's not a thing. It absolutely is. I laughed, but before I could answer, Zachary appeared behind me carrying 2 drinks. There you are, he said immediately, handing one to me without asking what I wanted first because he already knew. Jenna stared between us dramatically. You two make me sick, she announced before walking away. Zachary watched her leave. Was she bullying you again? Constantly. She likes you. That's how she communicates. I smiled softly and took a sip from the drink. Then I noticed he was staring at me again. You know, I said. You still do that constantly. Do what? Look at me like you're emotionally overwhelmed. He looked completely unashamed. That's because I usually am. My chest tightened instantly. The scary thing about Zachary was that once he started being honest emotionally, he never really stopped. He said things that stayed with me for days afterward without even realizing their impact. Later that night, everyone gathered near the lake behind the house while music played softly from outdoor speakers. Some people danced near the dock. Others sat around wrapped in blankets talking quietly. Zachary and I ended up slightly away from everyone else near the water. The lake reflected the lights from the house in soft, gold streaks while cold air moved through the trees around us. For a few minutes either of us spoke. Then Zachary looked over at me and smiled suddenly. What? I asked. I had a realization. That sounds dangerous. I think this is the calmest I've ever been. The quiet sincerity in his voice hit me immediately. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket, still his nervous habit after all this time. I used to think relationships were supposed to feel stressful, he admitted. Like constant uncertainty or drama or chasing somebody. His eyes stayed on mine now. But you just feel. He laughed softly under his breath. Safe. That word again. Safe. The same word he'd almost said months ago standing soaked in rain inside my apartment. Back then he'd barely understood his own feelings. Now he looked at me like he finally did. You know what's weird? I asked quietly. What? I think I realized this was serious before we even kissed. He smiled instantly. Yeah? You kept showing up at my apartment after midnight like a Victorian ghost with emotional problems. Zachary laughed loudly enough that a couple people near the dock looked over. That's a crazy way to describe someone bringing you dumplings. You drove through a thunderstorm to see me. In my defense, he replied, still smiling, I was deeply in love with you. The casualness of that sentence completely destroyed me. I looked away toward the lake mostly because my heart suddenly felt too big for my chest again. A second later, I felt his hand slide into mine naturally. You know, he said softly, I spent a long time being scared this would ruin our friendship. I looked back at him. And now? I asked. His expression softened immediately. Now I think you were always supposed to be my favorite person. That almost took me out emotionally right there near the lake. I laughed quietly, mostly to survive it. You really need to stop saying devastating things so casually. No chance. Then he stepped closer until our shoulders touched lightly. Around us, the party kept moving. People laughed. Music drifted through cold night air. The world continued normally. But standing there beside him, it suddenly felt very obvious to me how everything had changed. Months ago, Zachary kept inventing reasons to appear at my door because he couldn't stay away from me. Now he didn't need excuses anymore. Now he just belonged there. And honestly, so did I.